what you guys are actually discussing.
No, we are just introducing ourselves. Laura Lewanis.
Hi, I'm Laura Lewanis. I live in the West Middletown area. I have worked for the Delaware Department of Education in many school districts across the state and currently work at Christina.
Thank you for being here. And lastly, I think, is Joe Daigle. So we'll ask these folks, they can introduce themselves. Maybe people have stepped away, but we'll get started. So tonight we're using two separate online surveys, and Shane, I'll have you kind of stand by to share the links because you all can follow along, but I'm also going to share my screen. In fact, I'll do that right now. So can everyone see my screen? It should be an orange frame around a map of Newcastle County.
Yep.
Great. Good. And we really want for discussion to hear what people are thinking and why. So everyone in the group doesn't need to agree. We definitely want to hear about things where people have different points of view because that's the benefit of discussion and potentially building consensus. And that's what our process is about. I'm not going to go through all the ground rules. I think we covered that enough, and I trust this group is going to do a great job. So Shane's going to place links in the survey, links in the chat to these surveys that you're going to see here. And everyone also is going to get a follow-up email with the links. So no worries if you aren't completing this tonight. You will be able to do these on your own and have access to the information we shared tonight when you do those in the coming days. When people do the online surveys, be sure that you complete it in one sitting because there's no way to save what you did and come back and change things for either of these. You do, and I'll show you in a second how this works. This map allows you to place pins and then you're going to have to save those. But then once you leave, it will be saved. There's no other saving button except on the pins. And then you can come back again, like I said, so you can sit here, do this tonight, place some pins on the map. And a few days later, you can also do that again. Certainly we don't need the same comment every time, repeatedly in the same place, but you can go back multiple times. So.
Did you want me to put the survey link for the Google Sheets interactive map and the survey in the chat here?
The sheets is just for you to be taking our notes, but yes, gotcha. Why don't you start with sharing this map that we're working in? So the link to this, where and how to grow survey. Okay, so just to repeat a little bit of what Jennifer was saying to you earlier, orienting you. You see these purple areas, and you see in beige the areas that have community area master plans completed. Here in the middle is that Churchman's Crossing master plan area, which is in progress. Areas not colored by a color, those are areas that we really think we're not anticipating much change happening in the next 20 to 30 years. Then it's these areas in purple where our analysis suggests, there's probably an opportunity or need there. So that's what we're wanting the discussion to focus on. Questions for us to discuss: where should change occur or not occur? Do the highlighted areas identify, you think, the right places? And what should change look like and what degree? So these are our options. If, again, focusing on probably the yellow the green and the purple, where do we think incremental change is appropriate? And I'll move the map so you can see it better. And where do we think more transformative change is appropriate? And I'll pause now, give you a second to either click on the link and get over to this same map that I'm on, or just orient yourself a little. I'll do my best to zoom in and out if we need to, but let's kind of get this started. Where, do people off the bat have feelings about where you see some of these areas highlighted in purple?
Andrea Sumor here. If I'm answering the question correctly, I see the Route 40 kind of corridor there, Pulaski Highway. I think there could be some transformation in that area.
Okay. I'll drop the pin. Is there anywhere specific?
I think the corridor has a similar environment now, so, you know, maybe the majority of it.
Okay.
Yeah, with the map, and just to be clear, I can't, I mean, I know, you know, it's maybe it starts at the split, but I can't see where your map starts right now, but a lot of that, oh, just below the split, I see it now.
So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I'd say transform, yes.
Okay. Transform. And then if you think about these types, mixed residential, town, village center, or economic hub, is there a type that you had in mind?
No, but I can, I don't want to mess everyone up, but can I see that last screen again?
Sure. So the images just represent kind of some examples of what that development might look like.
I think mixed residential is oftentimes a way to go.
And so town village center is talking a bit more about mixed use in terms of commercial, residential. Mixed residential is a little bit more just residential focused.
Gotcha.
And then economic it's kind of a spectrum in some ways.
Okay, I see.
So mixed residential is kind of more on the residential end. Economic is more on the commercial end of sorts, and town village center is sort of a balanced mix.
Yeah, you know, by you saying that, the one thing I think about is you've got the Route 1 exchange that's not very far from there, and I don't know how that goes with the town center. You know what I'm saying? Like that with the corridors and the ability to be mobile.
Okay.
May or may not help. This isn't exactly where my strong point is in land use, but this is for sure, I think, an area where transform could work.
No right answers, so. Okay. And I'm still making sure I get this right, so I'm gonna place a different, you said mixed residential?
Well, if you think that the town village center is more appropriate for that area, I wouldn't disagree.
Let's hear, does anyone else have any comments on this particular area?
I agree the town center would be more appropriate.
Okay, yeah, I'm agnostic here, so.
Andrea, this is Deb. I agree that town center village is appropriate along the Route 40 corridor, but like once you get beyond, maybe, I don't know what that distance is, maybe it's 800 feet, or maybe it's 1,000 feet beyond the Route 40 corridor itself, maybe it transitions to a mixed residential, higher density and mixed residential. So you have some
choice for just resident, not so only mixed residentially.
I don't know what I was doing, but I was drawing their map and they said,
Oh,
I dropped out.
somebody we're hearing in the background.
I
If you
don't know
could.
how they can be doing it.
I
I was drawing on a map.
don't know how they can let you. They don't even know how to control Zoom.
So I just was logged out.
There we go. All
Thanks,
right.
Andrew.
Okay. Other thoughts about this one? We can, and who has other thoughts about other places? And we don't have to stick to this either. If you have general thoughts that you want to bring forth, this is really about discussion tonight. So we'll be moving on in probably 10 minutes to discussing trade-offs and strategies. But as we talk about this question, where and how should we grow? The door is open for any type of comments related to that you'd like to share. So
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry, go ahead, Cheryl.
I was going to ask about what sort of transportation assumptions are we making? Because it used to be in the old days, you sort of planned for your worst level of service on a work day or something to try to make sure that the transportation didn't adversely impact the population. 95's already like bursting at the seams. I'm not sure we can make it get any wider. And I'm afraid that if we put employment centers in further places from residential centers, we're going to create a worse bottleneck. So I just want to know, what kind of assumptions are you making about trips and changing, because we will be changing how we interact with the car. We already are.
Yeah, so in terms of this exercise, we can make, you know, we are certainly jotting down concerns and your thoughts. The way that we came up with these options was based more on the scenario dials, what we called scenario dials, so econometrics. One aspect of that is this idea of, you know, location, location, location. So where is growth? Where's the market? Where would it be attracted to add different types of development and grow? So we're not focusing, our analysis isn't looking so much at congestion and how we manage that. Actually, to point out, and Dave Gula, who's on here, is part of the organization, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, WMAPCO, that manages the regional transportation planning process. That happens, Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, 2 years from now. So this is focused more on land use. Certainly it needs to integrate, but we don't have a detailed analysis associated with these scenarios at this point.
Okay, thank you.
Well,
and I wanted to just say, is that the 202 corridor or the Governor Prince corridor in the northernmost purple? I can't tell.
So this is Philadelphia Pike and Governor Prince area.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, and this is Dave. Some of the areas are already very well situated for transit, such as Kirkwood Highway, US 40, the Governor Prince corridor. Those are areas that already operate with transit and a fairly high level of service. There's another area off of Route 9 and Route 13. And some of the areas aren't really set up as well for transit, and that certainly should go into some of the thoughts. You know, some of those docks that you've got Greenville and Hockessin and Pike Creek, where there's a little bit of service in Pike Creek, but there's not much in Hockessin, not much in Greenville. And so to your thoughts, some of these areas could be really well served for pedestrians or bikes, in addition to cars, which already are pretty well served throughout the county. And other areas already are kind of waiting for a transit. They've got the transit there. Churchman's Crossing is one of those areas. So there are some areas that you might want to consider differently, just as you're going through your own personal survey processes. If you are someone who uses different modes, there are certainly ways to consider that the use may be assisted by the modes that already exist.
I'm not sure how you can really make plans without knowing what the transportation in the future is going to be like. I mean, I'm thinking, I know you said that, Route 40 functions kind of fine, but I don't know if you've ever been on there, 2 hours before rush hour and 2 hours after. I mean, right now it's gridlock. You put a lot of high density housing or any more, it's without any kind of more roads. I mean, it's just going to be nuts.
Yeah, Dave, I don't think you were implying that we're not factoring transportation into this, but just for purposes of tonight's discussion, you kind of have to work through land use and transportation. So thoughts particularly about, where, as a member of the community, as somebody who lives in parts of these communities, and it sounded like we had a pretty good distribution or representation from around the county, but for places that people are more familiar with, or any of these areas, do you feel like the areas in purple make sense for, changing either in an incremental way, which would imply more slowly, or a more transformative way, which would be, more substantially different from what you see today? And then we're certainly, sorry, one last thing. We're certainly going to take this, and this process is very iterative. So, step by step, we get toward a lot of these issues as we move forward. But sorry, I interrupted someone.
That's okay. I wanted to duck away from Route 40 and talk about Glasgow area, because that's where I do all my stuff. And I think that right now we're at a point where the water capacity has been completely overdone. Like we have neighbors who have flooding in their basements already, and there's more and more neighborhoods and big developments coming in, and that's just going to lead to bigger and bigger problems for even more and more neighbors, and worse problems for the neighbors who are having problems with water already. So given that we're already having issues, I think the Glasgow Avenue area really needs to get toned down and not have so much development.
Okay. So when we zoom in, and again, these purple areas just kind of designate a general space. Is there a specific, like, I'm assuming more toward the south, this is the more commercial area.
Right. So more towards the southwest is where we wouldn't want any more, and that's where most of the open space is.
Okay. And you said water issues. You're meaning stormwater management issues.
Right.
Okay.
So a little bit outside of the purple bubble is like a huge wetland area, and that still has a lot of development. But the more we add to the purple bubble, the more outside of the purple bubble will want to be developed, is my theory here anyway. And so that I think would be detrimental to financing for Newcastle County and also for our neighbors.
But aren't we talking about like redeveloping current sites? And if redevelopment is done properly, they will do better stormwater management as we proceed.
Is that what we're talking about, redeveloping currently developed sites?
That's a valid point. We're talking about any part of the county, but I think that is a really good point, that when you think of development or growth, that doesn't necessarily mean new areas that currently have nothing on them that are developed, but certainly redevelopment is an important strategy. And actually the scenarios, you heard a lot of strategies that spoke to, you know, infill helping us achieve a lot of the community goals and objectives. Whereas development that would occur, you know, outside areas that don't already have service infrastructure would kind of not help us achieve the community goals as much. So good point. And Carolyn, to answer your question, we're talking about either, but it is worth remembering when I say, where do you think growth and change should happen? It doesn't necessarily mean changing a forest or an open field to something more intense. It can also mean changing an area that currently is a strip shopping center, you know, underutilized strip shopping center, to something that maybe has some housing, maybe has a small plaza, you know, to be used. And that could actually, to Cheryl's point, reduce some of the stormwater impacts. So
that's a good point, because I was wondering whether, you know, you were going to talk about redevelopment. I think the Route 1 corridor, or sorry, the Kirkwood Highway corridor, the Route 40 corridor are prime for redevelopment, because, you know, you have some of the older properties or older retail projects that have been built over there that probably will turn over, and making those properties convenient to redevelop to a mix where you have some jobs, you know, as well as housing, I think is a good way to go. A lot of that is happening in the city of Newark on Main Street. You know, there are many projects that we are involved with in the city of Newark, where older retail is converting to some of the newer mix, where they have office and of course, you know, because it's a college town, there's a lot of apartments. So, you know, those are small properties that are being converted to mixed use. And the county code currently does not allow for, you know, some of the conversions, the smaller conversions similar to the city of Newark. So maybe that's something to think about, as, you know, how do you incentivize these small retail projects on a busy highway like Kirkwood Highway or Route 40 to convert to a mixed use category, you know, because they don't have the acreage. Maybe they're only half acre, maybe they're 1 acre. So just a suggestion. And the area that you were showing before in the Glasgow Avenue, the bubble seems to include People's Plaza, which is a relatively newer retail development. So I don't see much opportunity within the bubble for development, other than maybe there is a little bit of land between the old Route 896 and the new Route 96 that could be developed there.
And to what Dev was saying, that Eden Square on that Route 40 corridor would probably be prime for the Grove that they're building by the Newark Library type of thing, which is, what is it, like a mixed of apartments and stores and walking stuff. Right. Yeah, that's a good point.
I just want to point out, especially for Shane's sake, I realize technically you're supposed to be the one doing these notes. I think that will make it easier for our discussion too, so I apologize. Shane will be jotting these notes down. So I
got them all going on the map in the background here.
Thank you. So yeah, someone mentioned Newark, which I guess you were speaking about College Square, right? Okay.
Yeah, I was talking about College Square, which is a larger project, but then there are several smaller sites on Main Street that are converting, the old, like for example, the Bing's Bakery, and then I think more recently in the newspaper they've talked about Haynes, at the intersection of Haynes and Main Street. There is a project that is being developed. It's a pretty massive project. It's a 6-story building, but those are the kind of incentives that you have to give if you want to see redevelopment and some of the older stock retail convert to mixed use. You have to incentivize those property owners who may only have like half acre or 1 acre, and they don't have hundreds of acres or tens of acres to do a larger town center like you see Buccini Pollen doing on 202.
Thank you. Who haven't we heard from? Let's make sure we hear from all who are wanting to share their thoughts on this question of where and how.
Yeah, one pattern I think that evolves over time is that we see most economic growth and development occur in middle class and lower income areas. So in the spirit of sharing the wealth, okay, so to speak, should we look at areas like Greenville and Hocassin to understand what could be different in those areas where they're more affluent, there's low density housing, very little commercial presence, no industrial presence. And so rather than placing all of these growth opportunities in communities that are already subjected to, the negative effects with traffic and everything else and all the pollution that comes from, density and population and industrial kind of environments, shouldn't we consider these enclaves that we've got in the county that typically remain untouched and continue to go, business as usual? So Greenville, should we consider it a transitional kind of an area where there's greater density in housing, not necessarily industrial, but at least some commercial applications there, and the same for Hocassin.
What do others think about that? And I see Jen nodding her head. Do you want to talk about that a little more?
I agree with that. I think, and what Deb was saying too about Kirkwood, I was thinking mixed use, how would you do that when it's smaller, older shopping centers? Hocassin, I'm not as familiar with Greenville, but Hocassin has a few little shopping center areas, but they're strictly, it seems like, stores and not any kind of mixed use. So I think there is some opportunity there, and they're doing a lot more. It seems like they're doing a lot more developing of residential places up in Hocassin. So yeah, just agreeing with what's being said so far.
Yeah, I'm thinking commercial beyond retail. So yeah. Space, not necessarily a light industry, but again, is there space for something other than just low density housing in these areas?
I think one of the things, just to bring back to our minds too, when we talked about the scenarios, and we'll be shifting over to that in a couple minutes here to talk more about those trade-offs that come with these choices, is, Dan mentioned a lot about the mixed use pattern of development and how, jobs housing balance, when you have places that are commercial oriented, integrated with housing, you not only offer people the opportunity to live near their work, which is nice. It has that benefit of allowing people to maybe not have to own a car or use it quite as often. But there are other associated benefits. You mentioned greenhouse gas and things like reduction and things like that. So certainly it would be a change in certain parts of the county, but it sounds like this group at least thinks that that's an opportunity. Who else before we move on?
This is Sue again, just to a couple things. So definitely agreement in the Hocassin Pike Creek and some of those Greenville area. What about, and I don't think, can you shrink your map just a little bit? I'm looking at the waterfront, riverfront kind of areas. Say we've got the Christiana River and the Delaware that I think comes up here into the Governor Prince area. I mean, we have waterfront property here in Newcastle County, and I think that maybe some considerations into improving some of that into something that's more focused. I think that could bring jobs, that could bring revenue, it could bring a lot, but I really don't see it marked in your improvement areas, except for maybe a small part just south of Wilmington near Market Street, right? There's water there. It's a little circle. Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, you bring up waterfront, and certainly Claymont is another area that has a decent amount of waterfront.
That's the one I was really hyper focused on, was the Claymont. I think that we have an incredible opportunity in that area right now as we stand. So is that another small circle where it says Claymont? So you have one that kind of points a little bit more north?
Yeah, what you're seeing
there
here,
it is.
That's the community area master plan that's completed and that's currently in legislation to be adopted formally into the comprehensive plan. So this area actually already does have a pretty mixed use plan for it. So that's why it's kind of grayed out, because it's in some ways been spoken for. Doesn't mean things can't again be adjusted in the future, but it has been discussed in community planning process in the last.
Would you say that you would want that more of like incremental change or transform for the Philadelphia Pike area there, or the waterfront area, I guess I should say?
She was talking about Market Street down here.
I almost think it has to be an incremental transformation.
All right.
And I would think of that, just to give people context, I would think of it as, do you want to see it more drastically different in form and function maybe, or a little less? So it's a bit of a question of degree. Certainly 30 years when we're doing a 30-year plan, 30 years is kind of a long time. So it's not like things would pop up overnight, but Jen, you raised your hand.
Yeah, I was just wondering how much you take into consideration when you're talking about the mixed use. What's the cost of the housing, the residential in those areas? Is it going to be, it's new, so it's going to be more expensive? Is there a way to do it where it's more affordable for folks to move there if they want to be closer to the jobs that might be coming in with the mixed use businesses that are coming in? So just curious about that.
So when we did some of our analysis that we shared, we did not do a market or real estate, an in-depth real estate analysis. So I can't answer that to the degree that probably is satisfying. Dev probably could speak to that in more depth than I could. But in principle, and what we were finding in our concepts was, you offer smaller or different, we have different incentives, and maybe, adjusting some of those incentives from what they are today to something that would enhance the ability for you know, multifamily apartment complex, any range of what we call missing middle. It's that housing types that are not just a single family detached home, but those missing middle, you would tend to get, you know, more opportunities for more affordable, you know. There's always the cost of land that becomes a factor. So when the market shifts, and that relates to the concept of gentrification. So, you know, that's something to keep in the back of our minds too, because when a place gets really popular, then you can price people out, even if the house, you know, imagine San Francisco, even if the place of dwelling is 800 square feet. So I don't expect that to be a huge concern here, but certainly, you know, offering more diversity of options in size and form are one strategy that we presented. And we'll shift over to that in a second, so we'll probably talk more about that.
And were you thinking of that would be like an economic hub for those, with the Claymont area and the South Market Street, or was that more, I guess, what is it, town or mixed, or no, town, what is it, here it is.
Town center.
Town center, yeah.
I think I was here in town center, but Sue, you were the commenter.
I'm just thinking, I mean, economic sort of was in the back of my mind as well, you know.
Gotcha, okay.
So both.
Yeah.
Maybe. You could
Yes.
do two.
I only put a water park there next to I have all kinds of great ideas. I don't want to have to travel to Sussex County to have cool things on the water. So that's where my head is. All personal, right?
Before we get ready.
I agree with that though. I was just trying to find a northern Newcastle County waterfront restaurant, and there are like so few that I couldn't even believe it, that had really nice outdoor seating except for what was on the riverfront, and I didn't really want to go there for whatever reason, but great point, Sue.
Okay, so I heard more activity opportunities in northern Newcastle County. Before we shift to the other survey and questions, does anyone have any other final thoughts? Again, this is available to you all. You'll be able to review this and add your specific personal comments on your own as well. So last call. Chime in, don't be shy. All right.
Just one last point, Andrea, with regard to affordability. I think there was, there was a question about, what are the price of apartments or housing. Yeah, I think we have to think about that. Not everybody is going to be able to live in a detached house. When we want, hey, we want all detached housing next to me because I live in a detached house. Not everybody can afford it. So if we are going to provide for mixed use, which is retail and residential, I think we have to provide for housing so that people that work in those establishments can live close by and don't have to drive, take a car and drive to another place, or they shouldn't have to live somewhere else and drive to their work. That's what we want to do. So I think we should think about that, or it's a good point that somebody brought up.
Yeah, so economic development and workforce development and focusing on those issues was an important part of discussions in the previous forum and other web workshops that we've held, but I'm glad you brought that up again. There's so much to be discussed, and I wish we had many hours. Okay, well, feel free, we can always come back to your thoughts on this, but I'm gonna jump us over to the next screen, and we'll just scroll through here. Again, you'll get a link to a survey just like this. And Shane, you can share the link right now with everyone, but you'll also get one. We'll send an email to everyone who participated tonight tomorrow, as well as our email listservs and everything. So
it should be the second link there in the chat is the survey.
Thank you. So I'll get us started, and feel free to also proceed through these questions at your own pace. And I'm not going to fill these out for us. I'm just going to use this to give us something to keep us literally on the same page. So we're talking about some of the strategies that we presented and some of the trade-offs associated with them. So I'm going to read the strategy for each, and then below each strategy are kind of a one or the other option that speaks to trade-offs. And this is just a point of departure for discussion. No right or wrong answers for sure. So I want you to discuss which option you prefer and why. So strategy 1, designating target redevelopment and community growth areas with associated incentives and strategies to attract growth and land use mix. Apply flexible regulations such as reduced impact fees, reduced parking requirements, form-based code, and other things to make redevelopment options more readily available for market changes and demand. So thinking about a trade-off that we would expect to be associated with this. We can foster long-term economic growth and reinvestment in areas already served by infrastructure, or do we like more the concept of short-term public revenue gain, such as what would come with collecting development fees? And if you have thoughts that send us in a slightly different direction, that's fine too.
I vote for A.
Can you?
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, can either of you who just commented elaborate a little bit? What's your thinking behind any of that?
This is Deb. Yeah, I said A because I think we should always be looking at long-term economic growth and not the short-term benefits. So if the short-term benefits are just, a temporary fix to this year's budget, that is not a good way of doing land use planning. I think for a healthy community, I think we should be taking a look at long-term growth and reinvest in areas where infrastructure is, or maybe if there is a place that we believe that investment should go or economic activity should be targeted, then we should build infrastructure to support that in those areas. So yeah, there may be parts of the county that everybody believes is a great place where a water park should be, or where it's a great place where the next Amazon should be located, or Apple should be located, and it may not have infrastructure. And so therefore, I think it is a good idea to take a look at those areas and build the infrastructure that is needed to support that. And it may not happen, this year or next year, but it may happen 10 years from now. So I think we have to think ahead and plan for the long term.
I mean, I generally agree specifically with the front half of that statement. We always want to focus on long-term growth. But can you say more about what the second half of that statement means, reinvestment in areas already served by infrastructure?
Sure. I think the intent here was talking about, kind of back to the issue when Carolyn brought up Glasgow Avenue, and we talked about infill as development, not just thinking about development in areas that don't currently have any buildings or any infrastructure. So that would generally, if you think of some of the maps that were presented, be the areas north of the canal, places that have sewer and have water today, and that have those basic utilities, roads, and schools. That's another piece of infrastructure when we think about it. Services, libraries, those types of things. So granted, Newcastle County is a pretty well developed county when you think of other places in this country that probably have fewer sort of suburban development patterns or urban development patterns. But in general, most of or more of southern Newcastle County is not served by infrastructure, whereas a lot of northern Newcastle County is.
Right. And so this strategy or this particular trade-off would indicate that there's a focus on reinvesting in or investing in areas where it's basically the infrastructure is in place and the infrastructure is ready. Okay.
So I have a counter opinion opinion. I agree in the opposite that, like I said, our area in Glasgow is already to the max capacity. And so I think that it's time to start thinking like what Willie said about going to Greenville and Pike Creek and Hockessin and getting away from these places like where I live with People's Plaza, which is new and wonderful and everything's full and working and we have good libraries and schools and everything's great. It's time to start investing and putting things where things fit. There isn't space anymore in Glasgow, and even parts of that 40 corridor close to Glasgow, like maybe further down, like we were talking about Eden Square. Sure, we can infill those not working strip malls and stuff, absolutely, because I think redeveloping not working development should be a priority. But when we're talking about using up open space that in an already working community like Glasgow or this Glasgow end of Route 40, that doesn't make sense anymore. It's going to start causing problems. So I agree more with Willie that we should, and I think this is what he was saying, don't let me put words in your mouth, but that we should start moving things farther out, even in Middletown. I mean, they said not to talk about it, but I don't see why we should be talking about Middletown. It's huge, it's open, there's tons of people there. They need more stuff to support that young growing area, including schools, and they're building the library, and that's fantastic. And in fact, I use that library frequently, so I'm really glad they're building another one. But they're gonna need another library and more schools, and so I think that we should be doing those things in those places, even though it's going to cost us a lot. I think it's a better long-term payoff, like extra long-term, because we are growing, and particularly in Middletown, they are growing and they need all of those things.
Yeah, Carolyn, that's why I really wanted to get clear on what the second half of that statement meant, because if you have existing infrastructure, but the infrastructure is already overtasked or overburdened, then you really don't have available infrastructure.
Right, even if there's space.
Right.
Right.
So yeah, that's a good nuance. Existing versus available capacity.
Right.
I think that's, yeah.
I think, though, to go back to Carolyn's, some of her points, I think you really hit on the trade-off. When you talk about schools and you talk about all the utilities, roads, things like that that need to be developed, and then you think about the way that revenues work out, if you have more spaced out, smaller, basically a way to think about it is density. So if you have fewer people in an area that are needing to pay for a lot more expensive, more voluminous more things, there has to be a way to pay for them. So that's also the trade-off that's being pointed to here is like, do we reinvest in areas that already have infrastructure so the cost of that would be assumed smaller, or to your point, spread things out, and maybe we'd be able to collect development fees because that would be new development on new land, that's green currently, but that would be potentially short term because over time you're having to pay for and maintain more of that with fewer people, fewer taxpayers, basically, is the issue.
So,
Cheryl, a comment.
Yeah, these are really difficult problems because you have to imagine what you want, and then to do this game right, you imagine your fantasy, what it looks like, and then everything will just magically come into place over the years as we develop it. Of course, that's not true, but we are in a planning process at a time of great change and great understanding of the need for us to change the way we're doing things. And so I almost think the opposite is true, where we have existing land that's already been disturbed, where we already have easements in place, for example, and some pipes that may be, completely too small, and we could have way too much impervious surface in an area. There's ways to redevelop it that that will improve the utility situation for all the adjacent land uses, because if you're doing it from the center, you can often get greater capacity increases, stormwater management, sanitary sewer, water supply, roads. Once that infrastructure is in place and secured, it's so much easier to work from there and get those intersections that you want to have the intensity of the growth in this, little concentrated areas, and then have lower density stuff come into the new land or undeveloped land. And I think the statistic I saw was that we're even behind the 30% goal today. So we need more open space, not less.
And that's really where I'm coming from, is how do we change this? Like, we keep talking about where do we want development? Well, where does my perspective about I don't want more development, where does that come in? How do we put more, like designate areas for like Glasgow Avenue that is at capacity? Sure, there's open space here, but we can't afford it anymore. The wetlands are already expanding beyond what they were able to hold, and that's in an area that's zoned for more housing. And how do we target those areas to say, no, you can't? While we could infill some parts that have been developed and then are laying vacant, sure, develop there, that's already paved.
But so I don't think our land use maps need to include, I think, a 10-foot level sea level rise, right? We need to anticipate that when we get down to the parcel by parcel specifics of it. But right now we're talking about conceptually at a high level, where you're going to have redevelopment. It's not necessarily more, it's just redoing the way it is now to make it better.
Yeah, that's a good point too, Cheryl, is that, it's hard sometimes for us to remember, 30 years. I can't even imagine what, my son, who's 7 today, is going to be like in 30 years. So it's hard to imagine what our community might be like then as well. So a little bit of this is challenging in that regard. But I think, this question and trade-off one, maybe we can move on, because it sounds like you guys have other issues too that we want to touch on, other trade-offs. But yeah, really exploring, what comes with redevelopment infill can have impacts on land preservation. Depending on the strategy being suggested, one of the strategies that was brought up was an approach that would, potentially allow development to not need to require as much parking. So that would be an incentive to do just what Cheryl was describing, fill in areas that already have pavement maybe with a building, and that then contributes more revenue that could lead to more land preservation, for example. So it is complex, and with 2 hours, it's not enough to get into this in the level that I'm sure we all would like. But does anyone else want to speak to this trade-off one? I think we'll keep moving, I think, because it'll keep us fresh in conversation too. What about a trade-off of more walkability versus larger yards? And you can, again, take this in any direction you want, but if you just think about, would you rather have the ability to walk to things in your community, more accessibility maybe by walking or rolling, or would you rather have things more spread out and, maybe have to drive more?
This is Jen. I think it would be great if we could move toward more multimodal pathways where you can bike or walk. But people do want places that they can go and enjoy nature too. So as we're redeveloping an area, maybe make sure we make space for some parkland where people could go. They like to be out in nature, but maybe don't need the larger yard to have to maintain or whatnot, as long as there's somewhere they can go easily.
I agree with that. I think we do not want larger yards and we want more walkability. I think you know, community can be developed where a house has a small yard but then has open space behind that yard where you have a hiker biker trail that, you know, people could walk and bike along that trail and connect to shopping and connect to schools. So kids could walk along within the open space and go to school rather than be on, you know, walk on the road or ride on the road.
Do others
I
have,
think
Dave,
Laura? Oh,
I think you pretty much need both. I mean, I know from personal experience, I know some people, you know, they like that small yard and they want to get in their car and they want to drive to a park. There's a lot of us, like I happen to live in Middletown, but I work in Newcastle County, so that impacts me. But I know a lot of us moved to Middletown because we like those large yards and we don't want to have to, you know, get in our car and go to a park. We want to have our space. We moved here for a reason. So and I'm sure, like, I know that the Glasgow area, there's some people there that are like that, and there's probably 50% of your people who, you know, don't want smaller yards and apartments and crowds, and they don't want the trade-off of having to fight the traffic. You know, they just kind of want peace and quiet.
This is Dave, and I think that that's a good point. But the problem that we seem to have now in this county is the folks who do want to live somewhere that's walkable and they can go to, you know, on their feet and they don't have to get in their car to drive. There's nowhere for those folks to live, and it becomes only one environment. You have to live in the city of Wilmington or the city of Newark if you want that environment, instead of living in an area, you know, along US 40 where you've got stores that are in a walking distance, but there's no infrastructure there's no sidewalks, there's no bike lanes, and so folks have to get in their cars and drive, which means everybody gets in their car and drive, which means you have a lot more auto traffic. So there are trade-offs, and that's part of this, you know, what we're talking about today.
But I think also it depends on the community, right? So we lived in all types, and when our son was young, we lived in a planned community where there were 1,500 homes on 1/3 acre lots, built around a golf course, 4 swimming pools, a clubhouse, and lots of recreation available by bike path. You know, so my son could walk across the street at 6 years old, get on a bike path, and go wherever he needed to go. So it depends on what's available in the community. You know, as we think about, you know, high density communities and access to recreation. So that trade-off between yard space and recreation doesn't have to be negative.
good. Well, it looks like we've got 5 seconds, so I'm going to get cut off here, but thank you for the conversation. And